I am moved to preach to you today on blind faith and blind skepticism. Now, I had a professor in seminary who used to say that blind faith is like this: garden gnomes, invisible garden gnomes. He'd say, I believe that there are many gnomes that run around invisibly, making sure that everything in the world goes exactly as it ought to. He called it gnomism. And what's more, he said, you can't convince me that there aren't invisible gnomes. Maybe you've heard a different version of this. You may have heard of the flying spaghetti monster, who flies around in outer space just above our planet and holds humans down to the earth lest they go flying off the surface and go into space. It is the flying spaghetti monster and not gravity that is responsible for our continued attachment to the terra firma. Now, I know people close to me, and I would bet that you may know people who are close to you who think that this is what it's like to be a Christian: blind faith. I believe it, and you can't tell me any different. Now, on the other side, there's also blind skepticism, which would say, I don't believe it, and if you do, well, then you're not as smart as I thought you were. So it looks like our only two choices in life are either to believe in invisible gnomes and harbor no contradictions, or to think that people who believe in invisible gnomes are really stupid and also harbor no contradictions. And both ends of the spectrum feed off one another to advance their proof of the stupidity of the other. Blind faith says that doubt leads to sinking, like Peter did. Blind skepticism says that a life without any doubt is pure stupidity. And so both would take the gospel lesson today like this. When Jesus says, "O you of little faith, why do you doubt?" Well, that would be evidence that Jesus wants us all to just believe. No questions, no doubts. This is something that's easy for blind faith and something that's a mark of stupidity for blind skepticism. I would say even those of us within the Christian faith who tend to be a little skeptical towards blind faith can't help but feel that this story of Peter trying to walk on the water with Jesus seems to be leading us down that path towards blind faith, the blind faith that we may find objectionable in our enlightened modern context. As if Jesus is chastising Peter, "O you of little faith," rather than having compassion on him. But what if Jesus' question to Peter, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" is not a condemnation of doubt, but a call from Jesus for Peter to take a serious, questioning look at his faith. Why did I doubt? And also, I would hazard a guess so that we can also ask, why did he doubt? Or why do I doubt? Now, Peter had traveled with Jesus over land and lake. He had seen the miraculous. He had witnessed the unexplainable, the healings, the feeding, and all of these culminated in this moment when he sees Jesus walking on the water. And when the world breaks into this sacred moment, as the wind reminds Peter that he's still in the middle of a storm at sea, that grasp that he thought he had on faith begins to slip away, and he begins to sink. But Jesus doesn't let Peter sink. If the moral of this gospel lesson really were as dire as "have faith or else," I think Jesus might have let Peter sink. And then he probably would have said something like, "Let this be a warning to the rest of you. Have faith or else." But that's not what happens. When Peter's faith begins to falter, Jesus reaches out and closes the gap. and he pulls Peter back to safety. In contrast to the way that those of blind faith or blind skepticism might interpret this passage, Jesus does not require a full, unquestioning faith, only a faith that makes the first few steps and then tries to find out, what was it that made me doubt? What Jesus may be showing us here is not a disappointment at doubt, but in fact a model of theological reflection. That is, a way to understand how God is present to us in our doubts, not how God is condemning us for our doubts. Now, some might object and say, well, Chris, it's one thing to interpret the gospel that way, but surely Paul, in his letter to the Romans, makes it a little bit more clear. There are 2 steps, only 2 steps. The first one, confess with your lips. The second one, believe in your heart. But again, I would say, believing in your heart does not necessarily indicate a single moment or decision to believe or to have faith. Now, I won't deny that a moment may come, like a conversion moment that we hear about, where you may just know. But for the rest of us, notice that Paul doesn't say, if you believe in your brain. He says, if you believe in your heart. And that's a much deeper and a much harder thing. It's something that requires your intellect, yes, but it also requires other parts of you. It requires your experiences, it requires your emotions, it requires your senses. You see, the second problem with blind faith and blind skepticism is that both assume that faith is purely a choice to be chosen in your brain and not a journey or a relationship to be experienced. They both assume that the goal is not to bring yourself to belief and keep yourself in a state of believing. They do believe, that the goal is to bring yourself to this belief through a sheer force of will, of your own will. And yet, if faith depends purely on my own stubborn will to believe, where did I leave room for God? Where is the space for Jesus to reach out and pull me up as I sink? When the world confounds my world to believe, have I left room for Jesus to close the gap? When women and children are kidnapped or killed in Iraq by militants, and there seems to be nothing that I can do, I tend to doubt in some way. Or when a terrified 18-year-old black teenager who made a wrong choice is gunned down by a police officer, as happened in Ferguson, Missouri yesterday afternoon. That can be tough to take. When I'm like Peter sitting in a small boat with everyone I know being battered by waves and asking, where did Jesus go? He said he would be here. Or when I'm like Joseph and life is going really well, I have no problems, I have a great new coat and confidence that God has great plans for me, only to have the people that I thought were closest to me throw me in a pit and sell me to the highest bidder. These all force us to ask questions of God, or to doubt God's power, or even, as I did last night, to yell at God in my prayers and tell him just what I think of the kinds of injustice that happen in this world. But blind faith and blind skepticism fail to understand that God can handle my questions, God can handle my doubts, God can handle my anger. Because as long as I'm questioning, as long as I'm doubting, as long as I'm expressing my anger to God, then I am still in relationship with God. I still have hope that where I see injustice, God is reaching out a hand to pull us up as we're sinking. That God will take the small amount of loaves and fish that we can muster and turn them into something that can feed a multitude. That the injustice that we see will move us to greater acts of compassion and love so that we will oppose the unjust structures of society that defy God's will for humanity. The truth is that blind faith hides a doubt of its own, and blind skepticism has no hope. Behind the strong facade of impenetrable fidelity, blind faith has one major doubt. It doubts whether faith can be sustained when questions are allowed to be entertained or doubts examined. What is great about some skepticism is that it allows us to ask questions and have doubts that lead us to greater faith. But blind skepticism will lead us nowhere. We will be caught in a circle that makes us think that doubt is the only thing that we can actually know. That doubt then becomes the goal. And that doubt is without hope. To choose anything other than the struggle of a relationship with God is either to choose to say, I believe, but I'm staying in the boat because I'm not sure my faith can handle the possibility of sinking. Or to sink into a despair that sees no hope for change and says, my doubt is so great that I'm not even willing to risk reaching out to God because I don't want to look foolish if Jesus doesn't save me. You see, our faith is not based on blind faith or blind skepticism. It's based on our hope that the reconciliation and redemption that we see in the world and in our lives might just be the hand of God reaching out to pull us out of the water. When we see people reaching across boundaries to help those who are suffering injustice, when we put ourselves out there and find that somewhere we found the strength to help, that is where we can find, reaching out to pull us out of the water, Jesus' hand. Peter needed the evidence of Jesus' whole ministry up to that point, and even the whole history and witness of Hebrew scriptures in order to understand how God inhabits the world so that he could begin to understand what Jesus is like and what Jesus was. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to doubt, and he wouldn't have been able to believe enough to take the first step out of the boat. And then, having tested his faith and his doubts, and finding that Jesus filled the gap, he and the other disciples were able to confess with their lips, "You truly are the Son of God." This is why all of us need to participate in worship and to serve others and to study sacred scriptures, to participate in our Christian formation, because these are the places where we encounter our faith and our doubts, and where we encounter the living God. As the psalm today tells us, seek the Lord and his strength. Seek his presence continually. Remember the wonderful works that he has done. Remember the miracles and the judgments that he uttered. Because blind faith and blind skepticism continually urge us not to seek God, but to be satisfied with the current narrative and either to avoid doubt at all costs or to doubt everything. But if we doubt everything, we will never believe anything. And if we believe everything, then believing is not worth anything. I'll repeat that. If we doubt everything, we will never believe anything. And if we believe everything, then our believing is not worth anything. The good news is that we don't simply have to choose between a faith that risks nothing or a skepticism that believes nothing. We can seek after God with our doubts, we can seek after God with our questions, and we can seek after God with our anger. But we have to be willing to get out of the boat, out of our pews, out of our comfort zones, and out of our excuses, so that we can find that the word truly is near us. It's on our lips, and it's in our hearts. And I hope that when Jesus asks us, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" that we can answer him sincerely, "I doubted, Jesus, so that I might come to believe more fully." Amen.